There we go.
Good job. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is the sixth webinar in our series of boater education and awareness. And we welcome you. And tonight we welcome Monika Wieland Shields, co-founder and researcher, Orca Behavior Institute. So let's see. So I'm just going to do a quick, brief update on the Southern residents who have come inland, Puget Sound, that is anything south of Admiralty Head, Deception Pass area, and on inland this fall for their fall forays, and then pull up a slide just with the population update. And Monika will be talking more about many things tonight. So let's see. So they're pretty much just right on time, a little bit later than the last couple of years where they've showed up in September. But so J-Pod came in through the fog and the smoke October 4th. They had been up on San Juan the day before. So it was a nice surprise to see them. We haven't had any rain. We weren't anticipating them for a while because it's been so dry and so hot. So we thought they might be even a little bit later, but they did show up. And it took all of the day to confirm that it was residents because numbers were coming in such small quantity and just didn't make sense. And we had just had bigs in the day before for quite a few days. So it wasn't really until the evening we could confirm, and that was just based on the number of whales, and they were spread out across Puget Sound and in all directions. So it became clear, and then I was able to see one fin in the darkness that looked like Cookie. So they stayed around. They were here on all day the 4th, but again, not many sightings due to visibility. They were here the next day, but then they exited and showed up off San Juan Island the next day on the 6th, and then they turned around and came back down on the 7th, and that was great. They've gone further south than south end of Bainbridge, Alki area. That first foray in, and then the next one there on the 7th through the 9th, they pretty much have been keeping to the northern waters, at least in the daylight hours, between that kind of South Bainbridge, Alki, and to the north, and primarily foraging up in the north, Puget Sound Basin is what I kind of call it, at the very south end of Whidbey, North Edmonds, Kitsap Peninsula there. They've spent a lot of time. They stayed those 3 days and exited, and then they went, as far as I know, Monika can correct me, I don't know specifically what days, but they did go north, and they were up in the Strait of Georgia and up off Campbell River, and then started to head back down. And then the morning of the 14th, they were seen coming down Rosario Strait, so we tracked them coming down there, and they did come back into Puget Sound and stayed another 3 days, and then left at sunset on the 16th out Admiralty Inlet there. And literally, like, I think that happened on the 9th as well, XT Inlet at sundown on both those days. So that's kind of in general. I'm not sure, Monika can update us, but I don't know. I haven't heard of their whereabouts after that. So, and then this is the latest population update from the Center for Whale Research that they put out the end of last month. But it goes through July 1st. It's the official census period is July 1, but it took them through September this year. And so there was a net loss of one for the whole population. And so we had in that last year period, the burst of 59 and K45. I will get a little teary to Cappuccino, Little Ripple, and Solstice. And So the population is at 73 whales right now. And I will then turn it over to Stephanie, who's going to do a little bit of 101 on vessel regulations. So.
Okay, thanks, Elisa. I thought actually that I would go ahead and let Monika do her program, and we will be doing questions and answers afterwards. So once Monika has given her portion, we will do a short overview of the rules and regulations around safe boating practices and marine mammals here in the Salish Sea. And it is my great pleasure right now to introduce Monika Wieland Shields, co-founder and director of the nonprofit Orca Behavior Institute, which conducts non-invasive behavioral and acoustic research on both Southern Resident and Bigg's killer whales. She is a biologist, author, and wildlife photographer, and recently published a new paper on vessel behavior around orcas in the Salish Sea. So thank you so much, Monika, for joining us tonight. And for those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the question box or the chat, and we will be collecting those for the Q&A session following the live presentation. Thank you so much.
All right, you seeing that slide okay and hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much for having me this evening, and thanks to everybody for joining us. This is a big topic, and it's kind of a hot topic. It's often, something that gets a lot of attention when we see boats of all types around Southern resident killer whales. And so my goal for this evening is to provide a very sort of high-level overview of the science that's been done around vessel effects in Southern resident killer whales, and a bit of an explanation of the rulemaking and how those rules have evolved since the endangered listing of these whales. And as Stephanie mentioned, my background and my primary interest in killer whales relates to behavior, and interested in, everything from social behavior and travel patterns and things like that. But I got my beginning in whale research with acoustics when I was still a high school student, and I interned at the Whale Museum here on San Juan Island, and spent time out at Limekiln Lighthouse, right when they were sort of putting the first permanent hydrophones in out there. And so I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time listening to the whales as they were passing by, and really, fascinated by all their call types and acoustic communication, but was also, a direct introduction to vessels and the impacts vessels can have on the whales, as well as we would hear small vessels, transiting at speed over the hydrophone, or large tanker ships going by. And there were times I had to take the headphones off because I couldn't stand the noise. And I was very aware of the fact that the whales didn't have that opportunity, right? They couldn't turn down the volume or take the headphones off. This is something that they were exposed to. And so the science around vessel effects in Southern residents is also something that I've paid attention to from the beginning. And I'll just sort of share some of that with you today, including some of our latest research on this topic. So, as I said, vessels are a hot topic issue in the Salish Sea. And I think part of the reason for that is because they're very visible, right? We know that the endangered Southern residents have kind of those three primary risk factors of lack of prey availability and exposure to environmental contaminants and vessel effects. But the lack of fish and the pollutants that they're exposed to aren't things that we see visually. And so I think we get a lot of attention on what we do see, which is boats around whales. And for better or worse, all our marine mammals here in the Salish Sea have a pretty urban lifestyle where they're exposed to vessels of all types. And we, especially when we're seeing animals that we care about and want to protect, sometimes have really emotional reactions to what we're seeing. And it's it's hard to know sometimes when we're seeing something that's okay, when we're seeing something that's not okay, in terms of the boater behavior, and also determining when are the whales really at risk and when are they just dealing with the reality of living in an urban place. With the advent of kind of social media alongside whale sightings, we get a lot of attention on the sightings pages as well about seeing boats around whales. And so it's really important to take the time to understand what the science says, what the regulations are, and what we're seeing when we're out there, because it's important to, report and document when we are seeing the rules being violated, but it's also important to know what those rules are and what they look like on the water. And so these images up here are just a selection of the wide variety of, vessels that we see in the vicinity of southern resident killer whales. We have private vessels, whale watching vessels, ferries, container ships and shipping traffic. And all of these, photos may, evoke kind of that emotional response of, I don't like what I'm seeing. But, in some of these cases, we're seeing egregious violations. And in other cases, we're just seeing sort of the daily vessel activity in the Salish Sea. So I want to start with just sort of going over what the different types of vessel effects are, and then a really brief summary of some of the science that has been done on the southern residents specifically. So we know for sure that affect marine mammals. That's incredibly well documented across all types of species, but that type of vessel effect comes in many different forms. For me, the first one that I think of is the acoustic impacts, and that has to do with the engine noise, where the noise of the vessel can either mask or interfere with the echolocation of the whales as they're navigating and foraging, or their communication calls that they use to talk to one another. But there's a lot of other types of vessel effects as well, including the interruption of behaviors, where due to noise or the presence of vessels, in extreme cases, whales may leave or avoid an area. This, for example, in an extreme case might be from military exercises where there's exceptionally loud noises in the water that may actually result in deterrence of whales, vacating an area. Vessels may alter the behavior that the whales are engaged in. Some studies have shown, for instance, that southern residents spend more time traveling and less time foraging in the presence of vessels. They may also engage in more surface active behaviors when vessels are, within certain proximities or at certain speeds. And in some cases, the physical presence of vessels can also interrupt key behaviors like foraging, where it may interfere with a hunt, of a salmon or something like that. So there can be a sort of that physical disturbance as well as acoustic disturbance of behaviors. There's also concerns about vessel exhaust and other pollutant exposure that whales may have, in areas where vessels are highly concentrated. There can kind of end up being sort of a low marine layer of fumes that the whales are breathing in. And of course, in extreme cases, oil spills and things of that concern are another one of those extreme vessel effects that we need to be concerned about. There's the risk for vessel strikes. This is much higher in baleen whales than it is for, for killer whales, but there are some cases where southern residents may have been hit by vessels. And so it's another one that we need to be concerned about. And then the cumulative impacts of all of these different things. So some of the vessel effects that have been documented in the scientific literature are pretty minor, where if a whale, tail slaps a couple times more because the boat is nearby or misses catching out on one salmon, in the grand scheme of things, that's very small. But if those types of impacts are happening regularly, they can build up over time to have a greater ecological impact on the whales, right? If they miss catching one fish because of one vessel, that's maybe not a big concern. But if there's a whole bunch of vessels and that results in them missing in a whole bunch of fish, then that cumulative impact is something that we need to discuss as well. So these are the different types of vessel effects that we talk about. And before I go into some of the specific studies, I want to sort of take a step back and look at the timeline of vessel management around southern resident killer whales. And this is a little bit focused specifically on whale watching, but these rules do apply to other vessels, especially private recreational vessels as well. And this is also very US focused in terms of the specific dates, but the timeline is similar for the Canadian waters as well. So in the 1980s is really when whale watching of killer whales started in Washington. And it really wasn't too long after that that people involved in whale watching or monitoring whales or watching whales from shore started having discussions about what's the best way to do this. So the Whale Museum started their Sound Watch boater education program in 1993. This included originally some shore-based education, but also, now has the on-the-water education that started in the 90s as well, about just educating primarily private vessels about the presence of whales and how to operate safely around whales as well. And they really worked in the early years in close partnership with what is now the Pacific Whale Watch Association. And they formed as kind of a community in the mid-1990s as well, originally called the Whale Watch Operators Association Northwest. And there would be kind of these annual meetings between the whale watch operators and Sound Watch about what they were observing, feedback from other, research groups and shore-based whale watchers. And there were really these kind of annual stakeholder meetings about how should we be operating around whales. And so this was all voluntary at this point. So up until the endangered listing of the Southern Residents in 2005, they were only really protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is pretty vague when it comes to vessels in the vicinity of whales. Really, the Marine Mammal Protection Act says, you can't harass or disturb marine mammals, but the definition of harassment or disturbance is left very vague. So up before the endangered listing, kind of these voluntary regulations that were co-developed between Sound Watch and the whale watch operators sort of got codified in 2002 into the Be Whale Wise guidelines, which we still know and reference today. But with the endangered listing, that's when things really started to change in terms of vessel management, because now there was an interest in putting specific regulations around Southern residents to help address one of those three risk factors. And, that's vessel effects and all of those various vessel effects that I listed. So the first federal rulemaking started in 2009 and resulted in the 2011 federal regulation, which required 200 yards from killer whales in Washington's inland waters. And it's kind of amazing. This is only 11 years ago, right? Was the first time that we actually had a federal regulation about how you could behave in a vessel around Southern residents. But since then, the issue has continued to receive a lot of focus, both, on the local and state and federal level, as well as, provincial and federal level in Canada. So 11 years ago, we had our first federal regulation. Discussions continued, was it enough? Do we need to do more? And the Orca task force in 2018, 2019, spent a lot of time talking about vessels and vessel management in Washington state as well, and ultimately resulted in 2019 with the Washington state legislature passing kind of a suite of vessel regulations that included moving boats back further to 300 yards, specifically from Southern resident killer whales, as well as implementing a 7-knot slow go zone within half nautical mile of Southern resident killer whales. And part of that sort of suite of vessel regulations was a directive to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to develop a licensing program for commercial whale watching. And so that has been sort of the most recent development in Washington state that went into effect, was developed in 2020 and went into effect in 2021. So that's sort of kind of the bird's eye view of how, management of whale watching vessels and private vessels around Southern residents has evolved in the last few decades in Washington state. And now I'm just going to walk through a few of the different types of studies that have been done over that same time period, looking at vessel effects specifically on Southern residents. And there are dozens of studies on this topic. And so I'm just going to sort of highlight the different types of studies and a few key studies and results that have influenced the regulations that we have today. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, the primary study of vessel effects that was happening here was through Theodolite Studies. And a theodolite, if you're not familiar, is an optical surveying instrument that's used for measuring horizontal and vertical angles and can be used to measure distance between 2 points from, an observation place. So these have been used, for example, on the west side of San Juan Island, shore-based viewing team will have a theodolite set up on a cliff on the west side of San Juan Island. And using this instrument, they could measure where whales were surfacing, where vessels were relative to whales, and they could look at specific measurements between boats and whales, and then also if whales are changing, their travel patterns or their dive times in response to the proximity and number of vessels. And so just one of these theodolite studies looked at the effects of vessels on the behavior of individual southern resident killer whales, and found, a quote from the paper said, boats exerted a small but significant effect on southern residents. And these effects included both the number of boats and the proximity of boats, influencing how straight the whales would swim or how much divergence they would have in their swimming path, how often they were breathing, and their surface active behaviors. And they noted in the paper that these relationships were complex and nonlinear. So it wasn't, a really clear correlation, whereas boats get steadily closer, whales tail slap more often, or whales dive consistently longer, because of course, these are complex animals and a lot of other things influence their behavior as well, just, including what are they engaged in? Are they traveling? Are they foraging? Which other whales are around? But this is one of these sort of small impacts on behavior that can have that cumulative long-term effect over time. So a lot of the sort of, early, 1 or 2 decades of studies were really focused on these theodolite studies that looked at behavior as assessed from shore. Another category of study that we've had is sort of hormonal studies, and these come from the primarily the fecal samples that have been collected from what was a conservation canine team, and now under the Wild Orca program, where they use the scat detecting dogs to collect fecal samples from southern residents, and they can get just an amazing variety of data from these fecal samples. And one of the things that they've looked at is stress hormones and nutritional hormones. And they can kind of look at how prey availability and vessel numbers are impacting, how these hormonal levels are changing in the whales. And just one figure from this Ayers et al. 2012 study was looking at trying to distinguish the impacts of the inadequate prey and vessel traffic sort of hypotheses on the southern resident killer whales. So the question that the study set out to look at was, are these stress hormones in southern residents being more strongly impacted by lack of prey or by the amount of vessels in the vicinity of the whales? So this figure shows 3 different factors, all of them on the horizontal axis here is day of the year. So you're kind of looking from left to right throughout the course of the summer. And at the top here is salmon availability. So this is Fraser River Chinook, and you can see kind of a peak of Fraser River salmon in the middle of the summer there. The second box here is vessel numbers in the vicinity of southern residents. And you can see that vessel numbers also peak in the middle of the summer around the southern residents when whale watching and recreational boating is kind of at its height for the summer. But what they found was that these stress hormones were at their lowest point in the middle of the summer as well. So really kind of the key takeaway from this study was that the stress hormones of the whales are influenced more by prey availability than by vessels, because here you had the most prey available and the most vessels at the same time, yet this is when their stress was at the lowest. So if vessels were the primary factor influencing this particular hormone, you'd expect the opposite, where even though there's lots of prey and there's lots of vessels, that those stress hormones would spike in response to the vessels. So this was suggesting that there was a greater impact on the whales from prey availability than on vessel presence. But of course, vessels could still be compounding nutritional stress during the rest of the year. So this was just one take looking at sort of an interactive effect between some of these risk factors with prey and vessels. Continuing on to another type of study that's been done to assess vessel effects are the Dtag studies. These have been done primarily by NOAA, where they put suction cup tags on the whales. And these tags monitor the behavior of the whale in terms of how long they're underwater, how deep they're diving, but they also contain a hydrophone. And so they can actually measure the received noise levels at the whale themselves. So this was kind of a new approach because up to this point, a lot of the sort of, estimates on how loud noise was as received by killer whales had all been done by modeling of acoustics underwater. But this was actually the first time we could measure what are the whales actually hearing as they move through their environment. And a real key finding from one of these papers was indicating that vessel speed was the primary factor that contributed to noise levels received by the whales, rather than the number of vessels that were present within 200, 400, or even 1,000 meters, which was not a significant factor. So this study combines some of that sort of theodolite-like technology with these Dtags, where they monitored where whales were surfacing, and as well as the vessels in the vicinity of those whales, and then compared that to the hydrophone data off the Dtag to see what factors of vessels in the vicinity of whales are influencing how loud that noise is that they're hearing. And just a couple key figures out of this paper. This is the one that's demonstrating that as vessel speed goes up from left to right on the x-axis, noise levels also go up from bottom to top on the y-axis. And you can compare this to the one that was looking at vessel distance, so how far a boat was from the whales on the x-axis compared to the received noise level. And you can see that there's no real correlation. Some boats close to the whales were loud, some boats close to the whales were quiet, and same thing further away. Some distant boats were loud, some distant boats were quiet. So this study really pointed out the importance of vessel speed, even more than vessel proximity, in terms of reducing specifically the acoustic impacts on southern residents. And as we kind of move up through time to sort of the 2015 up to present era, another type of vessel management that has been happening with a new suite of studies has concerned ship slowdown trials. And so this is primarily targeting those larger vessels, mostly commercial shipping traffic to this point. And one thing that motivated this type of management effort of slowing down ships was this 2017 study that was looking at an analysis of regional ocean noise contributors throughout the Salish Sea. And a key finding from the study was that the soundscape in the Salish Sea is really dominated by ferries, primarily making up about 2/3 of the underwater noise throughout the Salish Sea, followed by about 15% of ocean noise from tankers, merchant ships, and container ships, about 12% of ocean noise from tugboats, and then you can see a much smaller percentage of ocean noise is coming from recreational boats, whale watching vessels, fishing vessels, and other small vessel traffic. And so this is always something I really like to point out to people when we're thinking about kind of the entire habitat of the whales here in the Salish Sea. A lot of times we focus on the management of small vessels because we think of those as the ones as being closest to the whales. But when we're thinking about the overall noise that they're exposed to, it's really these large ships that we need to be discussing. And slowing down ships, like we just saw, is the main way to help reduce the noise that they're putting into the water. So these ship slowdowns were really started by the Port of Vancouver and their ECHO program in Canada, which starting in 2017 implemented these voluntary slowdowns for large ships in Boundary Pass and Harrow Strait up here by the San Juan Islands, which is really part of the, key travel routes of Southern residents when they're in this area. In years since, they've added a slowdown zone in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, as well as a lateral displacement of actually moving some of the ships out further from the region where the whales typically travel. And then in 2020, they started a voluntary slowdown out at Swiftsure Bank as well, which is off the western end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, where we know the Southern residents spend a lot of time foraging in the mid to late summer. So these vessel slowdowns have been studied kind of as they're happening to see how many vessels are complying, how much are they actually reducing the noise in the water, and things of that sort. And so there's kind of a whole suite of studies that I won't go into great detail here, but the take-home message is that slowing down these ships does reduce the noise in the water, and that they have a pretty high rate of voluntary compliance, even though that these aren't mandated regulations. And this year, we're seeing the development of a similar program in Puget Sound. So Quiet Sound is implementing the first voluntary large ship seasonal voluntary slowdown area starting later this month. And this is the zone of Puget Sound where this will be implementing. And with several hydrophones in the area, there will be opportunities to sort of study the impacts that has on noise levels and levels of compliance here in US waters to sort of complement the studies that have gone on in British Columbia. So with these, whoops, just lost my PowerPoint here. Reopen this and hopefully it works okay. All right, you guys seen that again? Yes, okay. So with these vessel regulations and voluntary slowdowns, there's the opportunity from these streaming hydrophones to monitor at least the acoustic impact on the habitat and see, are we having any, are we having the desired effect by reducing overall soundscape for these whales? So this comes from a presentation that was given by Veers et al. In 2018, looking at the Orca Sound Lab hydrophone, which is up here in Harrow Strait. And there's a lot going on this graph, so I'll kind of walk through it. But all the red dots refer to small boats. Recreational vessels, whale watching vessels, fishing vessels are all represented by the red dots. The black dots indicate ships. So these are the large tankers, cargo ships that are transiting through Harrow Strait. And on the x-axis here is the duration of how long that boat was heard on the hydrophone in minutes. So you can see a lot of the smaller boats, the recreational boats that are zipping by, pass in just a couple of minutes, whereas a lot of the larger ships that are transiting more slowly are heard, 30 or even 60 or longer minutes over the hydrophone. Then what you're seeing on the y-axis is the maximum decibel level that was recorded on the hydrophone from that ship. So again, you can see that a lot of the smaller boats transited very quickly and had a wide range of volumes and how loud they were. Some were quiet, some were extremely loud. And then that diversity in sort of transit time and volume is scattered much further for that large shipping traffic, where you can see there's boats that are really loud and take a long time to pass, boats that are quiet and take a long time to pass, and just a wide range of vessels being heard over the hydrophone. But what's interesting is sort of combining these hydrophone observations with those Dtag observations, where there was actually suction cup tags put on the whales. They determined that whale watching vessels specifically were mostly within that green zone in terms of the received decibel levels from the whales. So this is really highlighting how, if we're talking about only whale watching vessels, we're really missing a huge portion of kind of the acoustic soundscape that the whales are exposed to. And this really demonstrates how the regulations that have been put into place to slow down whale watching vessels, first as a voluntary regulation and now as a state regulation, has really reduced their acoustic impact on the southern residents, because they're making up this lower level of volumes that the whales are exposed to. And it's really all the other vessels out there that are small boats going fast or big tanker traffic that's influencing the amount of sound that the whales are exposed to. And this type of sort of, cross analyzing from different studies and looking at different risk factors is really important going forward as we continue considering sort of the cumulative impacts of vessels, especially in light of another study that was done in 2017 by Lacey et al. That was looking at the combination of reducing acoustic disturbance combined with increasing Chinook salmon as the best route to population growth for the southern resident killer whales. And so all of these vessel studies contribute to the policymaking of the vessel regulations that have been put into place that will reduce the acoustic disturbance. But it also highlights that unless we're also doing what's needed to recover prey availability for these whales, we're not going to see that desired population growth. So it's something that I emphasize a lot, that we could have completely quiet waters out here. If you imagine there were no boats out here at all, that still wouldn't be enough to recover the southern residents on its own until they had more fish available to them. But where this comes into play is when these recovery efforts happen in concert, where we're reducing acoustic impacts on the whales, which allows them, the acoustic space to find and capture the more limited prey that's available to them. But we need to really combine that with the ongoing focus on salmon recovery to make sure that they have enough prey to really see that population growth that we're all hoping for. So that was a lot of science and summary of graphs from some key studies, but I've just got a couple more to walk you through here. And one really important factor that I don't think gets talked about enough is considering the timeline of when some of these studies occurred relative to when different regulations have been put into place. So a lot of those theodolite and behavioral studies were done, as I mentioned, in the 1990s and early 2000s. And this was before the endangered listing of the whales. So this is before there were any actual vessel regulations in place, just those voluntary guidelines. So what this is showing here is a timeline of the last 20 or so years with where these key types of studies that I highlighted, where that data collection occurred relative to some of these voluntary and mandated regulations have gone into place. So in the early 2000s, and the yellow there is kind of a lot of that behavioral studies that preceded any vessel regulations. Some of those overlapped with the endangered listing in 2005, which is that first red arrow. And that's also when the whale watch industry ended kind of what was considered leapfrogging, where they would park vessels in front of whales, which was demonstrated to have an impact on their behavior. So these things are important to consider, because if we're continuing to make regulations based on studies that occurred prior to regulations going into place, there's a disconnect there, right, between how we think the whales are reacting and to what the reality of the current situation is as to what vessel behavior they're exposed to out there. So walking through this graph a little bit further, that fecal hormone data was collected in the mid-2000s. This preceded in 2010 when the Pacific Whale Watch Association implemented their voluntary slow go zone in the vicinity of southern residents, which was followed by that first federal rulemaking of the 200-yard regulation. Most of the Dtag data has been collected since then. There was a little bit of an overlap before that regulation went into place. These ship slowdowns started in kind of the 2015 and on era. Then in 2019 is when the 300-yard distance was put into place, as well as the slow go zone becoming of a state law in Washington state. So if you look at where all these studies I talked about fall, they all happened before our current regulations were put into place. So it's important when we're talking about continuing to manage vessels and potentially put additional regulations in place. It's important, I think, as scientists that we pause and assess how effective are the regulations that we have. Have we, mitigated some of the effects that we used to see of boats on whales by these new regulations? And I really caution against, making new rules that are based solely on this old data without assessing the impacts of these increasing regulations that we've put on the whales. I hope that makes sense. But we continue to have these discussions about vessel management in the vicinity of whales, and you can see that over the last 15 years, there's been new rules put into place, but we have yet to see that result in any sort of population recovery for the southern residents, right? Since 2005, their population has continued to decline despite these new vessel regulations going into place. And some people treat that means we need to regulate vessels more, whereas I really treat that as we've sort of done the work on mitigating vessel impacts, and we really need to focus on that prey piece to complement the reduced vessel disturbance that we're hoping to have for the whales so that their population can recover. So on this graph here, this is looking at, since about the endangered listing of the whales since 2004. In blue is the number of days that the southern residents have spent in inland waters during the summer months. And in orange is the number of Fraser River spring and summer Chinook salmon returning to the river. And you can see that over the last 15 years, there's a pretty direct correlation between how often the whales are here and how many fish are available to them during that time of year. At the bottom on this graph is in green there, the average number of vessels in the vicinity of whales coming from Soundwatch's data collection on the water. And again, looking at the past 15 years, you can see an overall downward trend in how many days the southern residents are spending here. There's an overall downward trend in Fraser River Chinook terminal run size. And there's also a downward trend of number of vessels in the vicinity of killer whales. From 2004 to 2018, the number of vessels was about cut in half in terms of the average number of small boats in the vicinity of whales. And that number has dropped even more sharply since then with the newer regulations that have been put into place. So this, again, is just another way of looking at and saying that we've taken some of the really important actions that were needed to help mitigate vessel effects around the southern residents, but that we also need to really focus on the prey recovery component to see the population growth in the southern resident population. So where has all of this led us to today? Well, very complicated vessel regulations as a result of all the science and all these concerns and all these studies. Where we are right now is we have different rules in the United States and different rules in Canada. We have different rules for southern resident killer whales and for Bigg's killer whales. In the US, we have different rules as to whether you're viewing the whales from the side or from in front or behind them. In Canada, the graphic on the right here showing different vessel regulation zones throughout the critical habitat of the southern residents in the Canadian portion of the Salish Sea. So they have exclusion zones where no vessels are allowed. They have fishery restricted zones where you can't fish. They have these voluntary vessel slowdown zones. And then not represented here is sort of the most recent addition, which is the Commercial Whale Watch Licensing Program in Washington State, which further restricts only the commercial whale watching vessels. So this is, kind of the result of many different agencies at different levels of government trying to do their best to mitigate vessel impacts on the southern residents. But the result is this very convoluted and confusing mass of regulations and voluntary guidelines that has unfortunately made it very confusing to understand how you're supposed to behave as a boater in a particular place around a particular whale. But at the Orca Behavior Institute, sort of tying back into our current research, with all of these regulations in place, and then the addition of the commercial whale watch licensing program, we were concerned about potentially over-regulating whale watch vessels. And that sounds kind of surprising, right? You think these are the boats that are around the whales the most, we maybe want to restrict them the most. But what our concern was is under the mandate given by the Washington State Legislature to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the whale watch licensing program can only restrict whale watching vessels, not private vessels. And so with the new rules that they put into place, limiting viewing hours of only whale watch vessels, the result is you're taking the most professional and knowledgeable operators on the water in terms of how to behave around whales. You're taking those boats and pushing them back to a half mile while allowing private boaters who do not have that regulation to be in the vicinity of the whales all the time. And our concern was that the whale watch vessels were playing an important role in the vicinity of southern residents to both model the correct behavior of what does 300 yards look like, what does 7 knots look like to private boaters, and also sort of being active sentinels for the southern residents by indicating their presence to private boaters, either just by being there or by actively waving down private boats so they slow down before they end up going too fast, too close to the whales. So with the implementation of this new commercial whale watch licensing program at the beginning of 2021, we decided to run a pilot study to help assess the impacts of these new rules and see if they were having the desired effect or not in terms of reducing incidents in the vicinity of southern residents. So we conducted observations from May through October of last year. We took data both from shore and on the water, which I think is really important because the SoundWatch data set is collected exclusively on the water, but it misses what happens when SoundWatch isn't there inherently, right? So we really wanted to capture, what's happening when there's no boats on scene, what's happening when there's only private boats on scene, what's happening when there's these different combinations of vessels. So we included shore-based data collection wherever we could, but we also included on the water data collection to sort of expand the geographic scope of where we could collect data. We collected data on both southern resident and Bigg's killer whales, since we were really looking at vessel behavior in the vicinity of orcas rather than specific orca behavior in this case. And we monitored all vessels within 1 mile of killer whales. We tracked the presence of commercial whale watch vessels, research vessels, education vessels being either SoundWatch or StraightWatch, enforcement vessels, which was primarily WDFW, and private recreational vessels. And we measured and noted any violation of the current speed or distance restrictions by any of those vessel types in the vicinity of orcas. And over our pilot study season, we ended up with 100 hours of observation across 60 different whale encounters, and we documented 329 vessel incidents that were in violation of the current laws around southern resident and big killer whales. So the key question we wanted to look at was, under the current licensing program that's restricting commercial whale watch commercial whale watch vessels, what is that doing to the number of incidents that are occurring by private vessels in the vicinity of killer whales? And what we saw was that when commercial whale watch vessels were absent, the number of incidents of private vessels violating the current regulations basically doubled. So when no whale watch vessels were on scene, we, out of our model, saw an estimated more than 6 vessels incidents per hour by private vessels when no whale watch vessels are on scene. When whale watch vessels were present, that number dropped to just over 2 incidents per hour by private vessels. And so this really is sort of the first empirical evidence of what has long been discussed as the possible sentinel effect of commercial whale watching vessels, where when they're on scene, we're actually seeing fewer of these high-risk vessel incidents in the vicinity of killer whales, where boats are getting too close or going too fast. And so We continued this study this year. We've just done a very preliminary analysis on this data so far, but the results are the same, where our second year of data collection has shown the same result, that when whale watch boats are present, the number of rule violations in the vicinity of whales goes down. And so this is a really important thing to discuss going forward as we continue to talk about regulating whales, our vessels around whales. At some point, are our rules too much, where we're restricting the wrong boats, or restricting boats too much, where we're having this sort of unintended negative impact of maybe increasing how often boats are driving fast in close proximity to whales? So what are sort of the overall conclusions from all of this in these last few decades of study? I decided to throw up this interesting graph that one of our interns put together in 2019. He did kind of a literature search on what types of studies had been done on southern resident killer whales from their endangered listing in 2005 up until 2019. And you can see the three risk factors are the three topics that have received the most attention, but noise and disturbance by far has had the most peer-reviewed public studies, published on those vessel effects. So there's sort of been a disproportionate focus by the research, and I think by the rulemaking and sort of recovery actions on vessels. And I think the initial focus after the endangered listing may be focused on vessels because that was something we could target quickly, something we could modify, pretty fast, rather than talking about salmon recovery or reducing toxins. But if you look at how much time we've spent studying and focusing on and regulating vessels in the vicinity of southern residents, I think we've kind of done that part. And we really need to focus on those other topics to make sure that we're supporting a healthy environment for them to fully recover, because focusing this much on vessel regulations at the expense maybe of taking some bigger actions on things like salmon recovery has not in the last 15 years resulted in a population recovery for the southern residents. So some overall conclusions from this summary is that vessels can and do have real impacts on southern residents, and these impacts take a variety of forms. The empirical data that we have now that we didn't have from our modeling data a few decades ago shows that vessel speed is more important than vessel distance in terms of reducing noise that whales are exposed to. What regulations were at the time of data collection for these various studies needs to be taken into consideration. If we're citing studies that were done in the early 2000s before we had any regulations in place, that's important to keep in mind relative to the rules that we have in place today. And despite most of the sort of regulatory action that we've seen since the endangered listing being on small vessel regulations, we continue to sort of focus on this topic both in the peer-reviewed research and by policymakers. And I think it's important to talk about shifting that discussion to let's follow the rules that we've put into place, and let's move on to discussing what needs to happen for salmon recovery and reducing contaminants that these whales are exposed to. And finally, the rules need to be simplified. We're talking about different regulations on both sides of the border, different regulations in different regions and around different types of whales. And when you're talking about, educating and enforcing and monitoring these rules, it becomes incredibly complex to keep track of. And if we're going to have effective boater education, I think things really need to be simplified so that we have higher rates of compliance. So just to wrap up, how can you help with all of this and help mitigate, vessel impacts around southern residents? Well, the first one is to learn the regulations and learn what different speeds and distances look like on the water. Because sometimes, we see on social media, on those sightings pages, like I was talking about, we see people complaining about boats that are in compliance with all of these rules. But what we really do want to focus on is documenting and reporting these egregious violations that are not in compliance with those rules. And Getting photos that identify the whales and the vessels involved, as well as video of the incident, is really key. Those can all be submitted via the Be Whalewise website, and it goes on to WDFW and NOAA, and they can follow up from kind of this citizen reporting and issue either warnings or tickets and fines to these egregious violators, so we can all sort of be eyes on the water, documenting incidents in the vicinity of the whales. If you're operating on the water, just my simplification of the rules is to just go slow and keep plenty of space from the whales. We know that reducing your vessel speed is probably the most important thing, and distance is notoriously difficult to judge on the water. So err on the side of giving all types of whales additional space. Use, look for, and promote the whale warning flag. I showed a photo of that a couple slides back. Where most of the Washington whale watch vessels are using that now, and an increased number of private vessels as well are flying a whale flag when they're in the vicinity of whales to help raise awareness to the presence of whales in that area. And also participate in public comment opportunities as they arise about new vessel regulations or other types of regulations and recovery efforts that are needed to help continue protect the Southern residents. And public engagement is always so key in that process. Okay, that was a whirlwind. That was a lot of information, but hopefully it was useful and informative. And hopefully we still have some time here for questions as well. So that kind of wraps up my presentation.
Monika, thank you so much. That was an incredibly helpful, really interesting, and just great presentation overall. And we do have a bunch of questions. So I'm just going to read through our Q&A here. I think you've addressed a couple of the finer points of some of the questions, but these are some of these are pretty in depth, so we'll just launch right into it here. So would you say the risk of exhaust pollutants was higher in the early 20th century with the advent of the steam power in boats operating in Puget Sound? Have diesel and gas engines made it less of a risk or more when coupled with fuel spills, such as the recent case with the sinking of the Aleutian Isle?
Okay, this is not my area of expertise. I don't think I can speak to sort of earlier 20th century ship traffic and what sort of toxic exposure might have been like then. But in terms of what we're seeing now, one of the studies that I did not mention that has been done did look at sort of exhaust in the vicinity of whales before and after the 200-yard regulation went into place, and found that moving vessels back from 100 to 200 yards did pretty dramatically reduce the amount of exhaust that they were exposed to. There's other considerations that play into that in terms of number of boats and direction of the wind and everything. But the one study I'm aware of that looked specifically at that topic found that our current regulations do a lot of good in terms of reducing how much exhaust the whales are breathing in. But that the concerns about fuel and potential oil spill are still very real and very big. And the recent sinking of the Aleutian Isle here in Harrow Strait was kind of a wake-up call as to just how real and how immediate that risk can be. And that's a whole other discussion in terms of how do we prepare for and regulate and respond to those types of vessel incidents.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. The U.S. naval boats, specifically nuclear submarines, use rubber shock mounts on their engines to reduce noise, as well as having raked propellers to reduce cavitation. If this type of technology is more accessible to boaters, would orcas be less disturbed by the presence of boats, or are they just more disturbed by how close the boat is, regardless of the noise produced from it?
Yeah, I think whales can be impacted by both the presence of boats and the noise from boats. But my opinion is that the noise factor is the biggest disturbance to them, because if it's masking their ability to echolocate, that's impacting their ability to successfully forage. I think quiet stationary objects are something that are less of an impact to them than loud moving objects. And in terms of mitigating the noise from vessels, I do think, the advent of quieter vessel technology is going to be really important. One thing I didn't touch on with those large ships is that a lot of them are not well maintained, and the extra cavitation noise from the ships that are not well maintained make up the largest vessels that are heard on the hydrophones in Harrow Strait. And so when we're talking about low-hanging fruit and what can we do to really reduce vessel noise, it seems like requiring, at the very least, proper maintenance of these loud shipping vessels would do a lot to reduce noise that the whales are exposed to. But implementing some of those newer technologies that might reduce cavitation noise and such would definitely be a huge benefit to the whales.
Thank you. Some more questions about ferries. So the ferry runs have been reduced because of issues with employment, timetables, et cetera. Is this resulting in a decline of noise, or has it not made much of a difference? Specifically Washington State ferries.
Yeah, really, most recently, I think it's been in the last year or so, we've had the most kind of service disruptions with Washington State ferries. And I don't think the hydrophone data and that type of monitoring the analysis of that has really been done yet. But there was a broad kind of assumption during the pandemic, when we had all the stay-at-home orders and everything, that would result in a dramatic reduction of vessel noise the whales were exposed to. And really, I don't think it was as dramatic as people expected it to be, because the ferries were still running, a lot of times at reduced capacity, but the routes were still being served. Shipping traffic was still coming through. So even when our lives are disrupted by ferries not running on time or not running at full capacity, they're still making the same number of transits for the most part. So I don't think that has probably had a very big impact on the whales, but there's efforts to start moving to some electric ferries, which reduces some of the noise. You still have some of the cavitation noise from propellers and such, but electric vessels do tend to be quieter. So there's definitely discussions with ferries in both the US and Canada about how to make them quieter overall.
And that was the next question about whether or not the new hybrid ferries that will be coming in will significantly be more quiet than the current ferries.
I think that's part of the hope. I am not, in the loop on how much that reduces their noise. But another concern that can come with that is the increased risk of vessel strikes. Then, if whales are not hearing these boats, could that potentially mean they don't know they're coming? I don't think that will be a concern with electric ferries, because I think they will still have enough noise that the whales will be able to know that they're there. But it's just another thing to think about in terms of, if we make a vessel too quiet, does that then impact the whale's ability to detect that a ship is there? But as some of these new ferries are implemented, I'll be really keen to tune into some of these hydrophone studies that are measuring received sound levels from ferries and what the effects are. But I think it's a little bit too early to know for sure.
Okay, thank you. Given all these in-depth research papers, are the policymakers really aware of how the commercial whale watcher boats are contributing far less noise than other small and large boats? And do you know if they're really looking into making the regulations apply to non-commercial boats and shipping? I assume that means the same regulations that are currently in place for commercial whale watchers.
I follow all the vessel science very closely, and I'm not even sure I understand all of it. And so I'm pretty confident in saying the policymakers don't understand all of the science that's been done. And it's tough, because you have different studies with different nuances, and what's the take-home message, and who's got the lobbying power behind promoting a certain desired outcome in terms of what the regulations are. So I think policymakers know that this is a issue that the public is very engaged in. I think they know it's been very well studied. And I think sometimes when we're communicating to policymakers, the nuances of science get distilled down into these take-home messages that can sometimes miss a lot of what are really important details. So I think they're aware. I think they're aware of the effectiveness of things like showing ships down, slowing whale watching vessels down, and the benefits that that provides the whales. Some of these sort of unintended negative impacts, I don't think they're aware of in terms of restricting just whale watching vessels. And that's one reason that we've, done the study that we've done, is to try and get some of that information out into the literature and into the hands of policymakers in hopes that they realize what this is really doing. But there was, we've sort of built this bizarre system for ourselves where the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife only has the capability of regulating whale watching vessels. So even though they're undergoing a review of the whale watch licensing program right now, they can't add in private vessels to these rules. The only thing they could do is sort of undo some of the rules for whale watching vessels. So if we want to talk about further restrictions that apply to all vessels, that needs to go back to another state or federal rulemaking and specifically apply to recreational vessels as well. Because unfortunately, the system that we have right now for WDFW, they don't have the power to make the regulations apply to other types of boats. So we've ended up with kind of this backward situation where we're regulating just the boats that know the most what they're doing. And then we have all these other boats that are maybe not aware whales are in the area, not aware of the regulations, and they have much fewer rules. And it just seems kind of backwards.
Okay, thank you. Are there any studies going on around the use of the whale flag in particular? And if there are they considered helpful to prevent dangerous boat behaviors?
I know that Soundwatch was doing a preliminary study looking at the use of the whale flag and maybe linking that to the number of incidents that they were documenting. We decided to focus just on the presence of different types of vessels rather than specifically the whale flag. I think there are incidents for sure where we see the flag being waved from a whale watching vessel or from shore, where we see boats see the flag and slow down in response to that. But in general, my opinion is that the flags are quite small, and that the presence of a whale watching vessel, be it an orange Zodiac or a large double-decker boat that says whale watching on the side, is going to get the attention of boaters more than a smaller flag that is or isn't being flown. And so I think the presence of the whale watching vessels themselves, just because of their size, their color, their recognition, is maybe playing a bigger role in what we're seeing with those having a positive influence on private boater behavior. That said, I still think the flags should be used, and there should be kind of increased awareness about them. But I think overall their usage is pretty low when you consider the entire boating community in Washington state. And I don't know if anyone's studying the effects of the flag specifically, other than maybe Soundwatch's monitoring.
Do Washington state ferries go slower to decrease their sound levels?
So they're not required to. My understanding is that most ferries do slow down when whales are in the vicinity. I don't think they're participating in the vessel slowdown that's happening in Puget Sound, because always going slower for a ferry would not help with the service disruption that we've been experiencing. And so I think they're more interested in going slow, specifically when they know whales are present. And that's something that we do see them do up here in the San Juan Islands. I think they do it in Puget Sound as well, where when they see whales or when they've been notified to see the presence of whales in the vicinity, that they do slow down. But that's all voluntary. That's not regulated.
So one of the slides that you showed toward the end of your presentation was the different literature, the different studies done on different topics. And someone is curious what other categories were represented in that graph, and what else in addition to noise and vessel disturbance could potentially be assessed.
Yeah, sorry if that was too small to read. So the categories in there were pollution and contaminants, and prey availability were a couple of the categories with the most number of studies that had been done. And then some of the 1 to 5 studies topics included kind of habitat usage, pathogens, genetics, social dynamics, modeling of multiple threats, and just general sort of ecosystem usage and local habitat of the whales. So there's been this dramatic increase in research on the Southern Resident since their endangered listing, which is of course warranted. But it was what I really wanted to highlight from that was I thought it was interesting that so much of the research has focused specifically on noise and disturbance and much less even on prey availability, even though we know how important that is.
Okay, just a couple more. How much of your survey data was regarding days with Southern residents versus Bigg's killer whales?
Yeah, good question. The number of encounters was greater for Bigg's killer whales than it was for Southern residents, just because they weren't around as much last year. But the number of observation hours actually ended up being pretty similar. So I think we ended up with something like 60 hours of observations with Bigg's and 40 hours of observations on Southern residents from last year. And then this year, it'll be a little bit more evenly matched because we had Southern residents around a bit more often. But interestingly, we put ecotype in as a factor in our modeling and did not see a significant difference in terms of number of incidents around the whales or boater behavior around the whales between the different ecotypes, which is probably, supporting that most recreational boaters may not know the difference, that they're just boating a certain way around orcas and don't behave differently around Southern residents or Bigg's killer whales. So that's why we were able to kind of lump our data collection together from both ecotypes, because a preliminary look at the data didn't show any difference in boater behavior around each population.
Okay, great. And the last question, do you think regulating private boaters as well as whale watching boats could be implemented effectively? It's kind of a juicy question for the last
Do I think it could be implemented effectively? Yes. I think, like I said, the rules just need to be made more simple. I think we need a set distance and a set speed that applies to all vessel types around all killer whales. That's something that's easy to communicate, easy to understand, and a lot easier to enforce than what we have right now. And if we have all vessel types with the same rules, then we can point to the whale watch operators as modeling those behaviors. So when the education and enforcement vessels are out there, they can say, look at what these boats are doing. They're showing you how far away you can be. They're showing you the speeds you can operate, model your behavior off of that. So really, in my world, the ideal would be, I love the 300 yards around Southern residents. I love the 7 knot slow go zone. If we want to regulate commercial whale watching vessels, let's regulate the number of them that can be on scene at a particular time. But let's allow them to, follow those same rules that we're allowing private boaters to follow, so they can be there to model that behavior and play that kind of sentinel role. And it will just, it'll make everything simpler and easier and more effective to communicate about and to educate about. So I do think it's possible. I think we've gotten ourselves into this kind of crazy complex mess where there's all these different rules in these different situations, but hopefully in the next few years, we can work towards making the rules more cohesive, on each side of the border around different types of orcas, and just making everything simpler in a way that does have a true positive benefit to the whales, and primarily that comes down to going slow and giving them enough space.
Thank you so much, Monika. Somebody typed one more, not a question, in the Q&A box, but just to say thank you to you and to the Orca Behavior Institute, and just thank you so much for being here and sharing that knowledge with us tonight. It was really a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
And Lisa, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Do you know of, or have you heard of any other governmental or NGOs doing studies similar to yours, so we can have some science to back up anything after this latest round of regulations and any effect it's having one way or the other?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's, we we need to study the regulations we put into place to see if they're effective. And there are other groups doing some studies. Oceans Initiative has been continuing some of their shore-based theodolite work, including since the new regulations have gone into place. And I believe they've done some contract work specifically with WDFW to help assess the effectiveness of the regulations. So I haven't seen any publications on that yet, but I know that they've collected some data. And then, of course, Soundwatch and Straightwatch are out there on the water as well, continuing their data collection. And I know that they've been discussing modifying or adding to some of their data collection to help assess the effectiveness of these rules as well. So there is some other work going on that topic for sure. And hopefully in the next few years, there will be some new studies shedding insights on the current situation and maybe how we move forward.
Thank you. And I just want to personally say thank you. I always appreciate listening to you because you are science-based, and also, you know, those of us, you also speak in layman terms. So, and you always have helped us understand a lot of the science and papers and in digestible ways, and really appreciate that. And all the work you do, and that you took on doing a study yourself. So appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again, Monika. And I just want to take a couple minutes now to very quickly, because Monika's covered a lot of what I was going to talk about anyway, go over the rules and guidelines for boaters, recreational boaters, and around marine mammals in the Salish Sea. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm the program manager for Orca Network. My name is Stephanie Raymond, and part of what I do is work on the Share the Water Boater Education Program. So this is a presentation that I can give in an expanded form to your marina or your yacht club or community group if you're interested in knowing more about the specifics of the rules and regulations here. This is just a really brief overview. And there's a lot of layers, as Monika pointed out, lots of complicated layers to our regulations here. We have just as a boater, there's the rules of the road. There's NOAA's federal regulations around marine mammals. There's Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canadian regulations, which are different. And I'm not going to be going into that tonight for the purposes of time. But if you want more information about that, check out the Be Whale Wise website or drop me a line. I'm happy to talk to you about that more. And then we have Washington state law. So really briefly, the basic navigation rules and regs: that every vessel shall have a proper lookout and that every vessel shall operate at safe speed. And if you're doing both of these things, that's already half the battle won, as far as, you know, you're paying attention to your surroundings. So you're aware of marine mammals with plenty of time, hopefully, to take appropriate action. And we know that they can sometimes, you know, surface anywhere and maybe closer than you wanted them to. But if you're keeping a good lookout and you're operating at a reasonable speed, it's less likely that you're going to have an unfortunate encounter with a whale that comes up too close to you. As Monika mentioned, there's two kinds of orcas in the Salish Sea. The salmon-eating residents are our endangered population, and the mammal-eating transients or Bigg's killer whales are the ones that have the 200-yard regulation, because they're not listed as an endangered population. Always assume if you see an orca out there when you're on the water, unless you are absolutely 100% trained to know the difference between the two, always assume that they're residents, because the residents have the stricter regulations around them. And that way, you know, you're following the proper rules. NOAA says that when you're watching whales by boat, and this is true in all US waters, that you should remain at least 100 yards from all whales, keep 200 yards away from killer whales in Washington state inland waters, limit the time that you spend observing individuals to 30 minutes or less. Don't chase, encircle, or leapfrog the whales with any sort of watercraft. This doesn't just apply to boats, but also paddleboards and kayaks. Also, the jet skis. If you encounter whales, slow down and operate at no wake speed. Put your engine in neutral when the whales approach to pass. Avoid approaching whales if calves are present, and never get between a mother and a calf. Now that's NOAA's overarching federal guidelines for all US waters. In Washington state, we have more specific rules that no vessel or any other sort of watercraft may approach a southern resident killer whale within 300 yards. nor should any vessel or other watercraft be in a position 400 yards in front of or behind the path of travel of the southern resident killer whales. If you are within 300 yards of a southern resident killer whale, so for example, you're traveling at the appropriate speed and then suddenly they dive, change direction, and come up within that 300-yard zone, you should disengage your transmission. So your engine is essentially turned off, and you let them pass at their pace before you re-engage your transmission until they're 300 yards away from you again. And also, if you're within 1/2 nautical mile of the southern residents, then you are going at a speed of 7 knots or less. You're also not allowed to feed the southern residents. They just do that one in there. I'm not sure that anybody was really doing that before, but just in case, now you know. Now there are exceptions for these rules, especially for military and commercial vessels, fishing vessels, and commercial whale watching vessels. So if you see boats close to whales, again, you know, as Monika said, we can have a really emotional response to that, but that does not mean necessarily that there's a violation in place. And if you have questions about your own particular vessel that you are operating and the circumstances you're operating it in, consult the Revised Code of Washington for those specific regulations that you need to be following. This is a nice summary in general. That you're staying 300 to 400 yards away from southern resident orcas. You're staying 200 yards away from the Biggs or transient orcas. But again, if you don't know the difference, assume that they're residents. And stay 100 yards away from baleen whales and all other marine mammals. Make sure that you are traveling at a slow speed under 7 knots when you're within a 1/2 nautical mile of any whale. That's a legal requirement for the southern residents, but it's an excellent best practices guideline for the other types of whales that we have here and will help to ensure that those whales stay safe as well. It's also really important to note that accurately estimating distance over water is an extremely difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of practice. There has been some science done on this as well that show that people tend to underestimate the amount of space over water between themselves and an object in the distance. So if you're out there on the water on a regular basis, it's a really good idea to practice estimating distance over water using radar or GPS with stationary items like buoys or things like that, so that you can really kind of start to judge for yourself what it looks like in different conditions and different distances. The whale warning flag, if you see one being flown by a vessel, slow down because it means that whales are in the vicinity. If you have one, fly it within 1/2 nautical mile of any whales, and be sure that you're remembering to slow down as you're doing that, and sending in a whale sighting report is also a great thing. You can go to whaleflag.org to order a whale flag, and there's a few different places they list there where you can purchase those for your own boat. And if you see a whale, Orca Network really appreciates if you will report that to our whale sighting network. We post any sightings that are reported. Anyone who sees a whale can report a sighting, and that sighting information is available on Facebook in real time or as an email digest format. This is available for researchers as well as the general public. And this can help you both to be aware that there's a whale in the vicinity so that you can be using extra caution if you are out in a boat, to be sure that you're avoiding any violations around those whales. Things to report if you see a whale are the time, date, and location, the type of whale if you know, how many animals are present, what's their direction of travel, any notable behaviors, include any photos or videos that you might have, and your contact information in case we have questions about that. And you can report those sightings using the 800 number on the screen, sightings@orcanetwork.org, or by posting to one of our threads on Orca Network on Facebook. Now, if you see violations happening, you want to report that as well. That's the same information that you're collecting for any other sighting, and including the vessel registration number if you can. It's really important to have a really good description of the vessel or a really good image of the, if you're sending in a picture, a good image of the registration in order to be sure that people, that the enforcement agencies can actually identify the boat and get in touch with the registered owner. BeWhaleWise.org has an online violations reporting form. And then there's also these 2 phone numbers in the United States and Canada, different phone numbers, but you can make those reports there as well. Should you happen to encounter an entangled or injured whale, please report it immediately. That's a different reporting number in the US than the violation reporting number, so you'll want to have both of them in your phone if you're out on the water a lot. It is not recommended that you make a report about an injured or entangled marine mammal over VHF channel 16, because if other people are monitoring 16, then they might want to come over and take a look, and we don't want more boats around an injured or entangled whale because we don't want to stress it out further. Same information as any other sighting report should be what you include, as well as details about the situation, and be sure to include your contact info there. Any photographs that you can take and submit as part of your report are really critical. Even if it doesn't look like it to you, there might be something in that image that will help a responder understand what's happening. And it may be it's often possible that the entanglement itself might not be visible, but something else about the picture might be helpful for someone who's trying to decide how to respond to that situation. Please do not approach or attempt to disentangle any entangled animals, despite all the things that we see on YouTube. It's really not something that we want to do. Entangled animals can be very unpredictable and extremely dangerous. So please do not approach them and try to help them yourself. You can help with whale safe boating, as Monika demonstrated. There's a lot of recreational boaters out there who are not aware of the proper regulations around whales, or maybe they just aren't really paying attention to what they're doing when they're out on the water. So if you are interested in distributing Share the Water materials at your marina or yacht club, or having a free whale safe boating presentation come out, or if you'd like to become a whale sighting network volunteer, you can drop me an email at Stephanie@Orca Network, and I'd be happy to give you more information about any of those. So just remember, when you're out there on the water, whales are out there. Some of them are slow, low to the surface, and that makes them harder to spot. So make sure you're keeping a good watch. All whale species can appear anywhere and at any time. And reporting whale sightings helps the whales, the mariners, and the scientists. So please keep your eyes open out there. Let us know what you see. And thank you so much for joining us tonight for this webinar. Are there any questions before we close this out? Let's see.
Liam does have one.
Yeah, let me go ahead and see if I can let you speak there, Liam. Yeah, go ahead. What's your question?
Thanks. I just wanted to ask if I could get a copy of that presentation. I know I'm thinking about learning to become a boater and having that. And you said you had either an extended presentation or the same presentation available. So I was wondering if I could have a copy of that, please.
Yeah, you should be able to see some of that on our YouTube channel. If you look up our Share the Water presentations, a lot of the extended presentation is available on, I think it's the 4th webinar, but this is the 6th one of these that we've done. So there are 5 other recordings there that you can find on our YouTube channel that have those presentations about different topics around whale safe boating. And then this one will eventually also be added there when we upload it to YouTube.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us, and I hope you have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good to have you here and see names.